very famous Vilna Gaon, the Gra, points out that in Tilim Ayin Vav, which is the Shir Shal Yom that we recite on the first day of Sukkot, we say the pasuk, Vayhi b'shalem Sukkoi ma'nosoi b'tzion. Sukkah was complete, possibly Yerushalayim Shalem, U'ma'nosoi in his dwelling place in Zion. The Gra understood from that pasuk that there's a correlation, a connection between Sukkah and the mitzvah of residing, living in Eretz Yisrael. Two mitzvahs in the Torah. One of the Taryag mitzvahs, according to the Gra, according to the Ramban and others, is inhabiting Eretz Yisrael. There was a time that I remember somebody once defined a Zionist as somebody, Mr. A, who asks for a donation from Mr. B so that Mr. C can live in Israel. That was the definition of a Zionist. On the one hand, it sounds peculiar, but there is a position in halacha as well that supporting somebody living in Eretz Yisrael is contributing to the habitation of Eretz Yisrael. But leave that aside for a moment. One of the Talmidei HaGra, the Pas HaShulchan, takes that position. But the Gra points out that there are two mitzvahs that you enter in with your entire body. Generally, mitzvahs are fulfilled with with your hands, your feet, your eyes, tasting. But here it's the entire person enters into the mitzvah, Sukkah and Eretz Yisrael. That's one level of connection and correlation, but that would seem to be a message that on a thematic level, that conceptually there must be something at work over here in the relationship between these two mitzvahs. Mitzvah of Sukkah, we find that on the ultimate day of judgment, the non-Jewish nations, the Gentile nations, will ask for a mitzvah. They're confronted now with the reality that they failed in their interpretation of what life is about, so they ask for a mitzvah. Gemara relates that the Rebbeinu Shalom says to them, I'll give you an easy mitzvah, the mitzvah of Sukkah. They're enthusiastic, they build their Sukkot. A blistering sun comes out, and it becomes nigh impossible to sit in the Sukkah. They get angry, frustrated, and they kick the Sukkah and run away. They fail. Commentaries point out that halachically, if it's intolerable to sit in the Sukkah, a Jew is also exempt from the mitzvah of Sukkah, mitztaya. He's in pain. The discomfort becomes so exceedingly overwhelming that but he doesn't kick the Sukkah. He doesn't leave in a state of anger. Because just like the halacha determines when to sit in the Sukkah, the halacha determines when not to sit in the Sukkah. Okay, so Sukkah somehow then is the arbiter. It's the litmus test. It differentiates between the Jew and the non-Jew. Again, conceptually, why would that be so? When the Beis Midrash was up and running, Klal Yisrael accepted sacrifices from the neighboring Jewish nations. When the non-Jew sent a korban, sent a sacrifice, it was invariably always treated as a korban olah. Difference between an olah and a shlomim, there are a lot of categories, but these two primary categories, an olah is completely consumed on the altar, on the mizbeach. Shlomim, part is eaten. And the Gemara discusses, the Gemara in Menachos, why is it that we always automatically treat the sacrifice that is sent by the non-Jew as a korban olah, completely consumed? Now, one might expect to find some scriptural derivation for such an idea, such a halacha. That's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara says it's an analysis of his psyche, the psychological state. Libo lashamayim is that when he wants to be engaged in spirituality, he finds it contradictory and unacceptable to have any kind of physical satisfaction or enjoyment from the experience. It must be one or the other, either the spiritual or the physical. That's what leads to a conception of spirituality, an ideal, according to the non-Jewish world, as being ascetic, monastic, to deny the physical world. That's what spirituality is about. It's either or. Either you're engaged in spirituality or in the physical universe, the material world. The Jew comes along and says, no, that's a false proposition. We have been created in a manner that we have the potential to take the material world, to take the physical universe, to take the empirical realities of our day-to-day existence and translate them into spirituality. That's what life is about for the halachic Jew. To deny the physical world is to deny the reality of the nature of man. God created us in such a manner that we must have the physical experience and translate from the language of the physical to the spiritual by defining it and giving it halachic norms. The word halacha is haloch, to go. The manner in which we go through life is to take that which is potentially merely a physical experience and harness it, capture it, define it, give it boundaries, direction, and then by that focus, it is then a conduit that is energized to produce spiritual energy. Can we skip over that and go directly to the spiritual? Doesn't work. So one might put it like this, that everybody's familiar with listening to a radio broadcast and there's a commercial on the broadcast. So people, at best, sit impatiently tolerating the commercial, waiting to get back to the program. The Torah Jew says, no. It's all part of the program. It's all a commercial. It's all part of the program. They are identically congruent because everything in the human realm of experience is potentially available to be elevated for spirituality. In a sense, this helps us understand another question. Why do Jews need a country? If it's a religion, what does it need a national homeland? Why does it need space and to have sovereignty within that space? What's the purpose of that? There must be some necessity for that. Given this Vilna Gaon, this Gaon, and the way we are defining Sukkah and Eretz Yisrael, it means only by living in our own space with our own halachic sovereignty does every aspect and every facet of human experience come under the purview of potential spirituality. Of course, Jews, because it was predicted in the admonishment, it was predicted that we would have to go into exile if we didn't fulfill our mandate here in Eretz Yisrael. The ideal mandate here in Eretz Yisrael would be to set up a model state that has the perfect flow from the material to the spiritual and back again, informing the physical. The Torah commentary, the halachic commentary, the Torah brings that the three central holidays of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot correspond to the three patriarchs. Avram corresponds to Pesach, Yitzchak to Shavuot, and Yaakov to Sukkot. In fact, the first time that the word Sukkot is mentioned is by Yaakov. It says he built these huts for his cattle, Sukkot for his cattle. It's also not accidental that Talmud teaches Avram referred to the place of the Beis Mikdash as a mountain, as a har. Yitzchak referred to it as a sadeh, as a field. Yaakov referred to it as a house, a building. What is the connection between building a building and a sukkah? They have mechitzas. They have partitions. They have walls. A wall keeps what's outside out and what's inside in. The Ramban in Parshas Lech Lecha points out that Avram and Yitzchak both went to the universal community to proselytize. Vayikra b'shem Hashem. They talked to the world at large, to the nations of the world. By Yaakov, you don't find that anymore, says the Ramban. Why? Because Yaakov has now perfected his clan, his family, with the shiftei kor, the tribes, that there's going to have to be an internal energy that will create a nation, religion, state. And that nation, religion, state will be a laboratory demonstrating to the world community what is an ideal existence. And if we had our act together, says the Alshich, then it would be like a magnet drawing the filings of those sensitivities to Israel. Rashi already alludes to that in the description of the blessings given by Yaakov to the tribes. Non-Jews will come to Israel to do business with Zvulun. He travels, export, import. And while they're here, they'll say, well, you know what? Let's go up and visit Jerusalem if we're here already. They go up to Yerushalayim, and they're awestruck. They're overtaken by the spiritual energy and what they feel and see, what they witness. But that's when Am Yisrael is doing their thing, and there isn't a spiritual entropy, that the loss of that heat, of that intensity. When we begin to fail, there's a seeping, and that seepage leads to us having to go into galut, into exile. And we have to retrieve what is called in the language of the Zohar, sparks of spirituality, nitzotzos of Kedusha. We have to retrieve them by us going the circuit abroad in exile. Didn't have to be that way. We could have been a magnet drawing them here. But when we aren't achieving a sufficient level of intensity, then we have to go out there to put it together. And so, Yaakov, mechitzas means yes. There's a special mission statement of Klal Yisrael. That special mission statement is about Tikun Olam, bringing about a perfection of the world. But it's amazing how that term has been dislocated and misapplied. It's based on what we say in the prayer of Aleinu, Lesaken Olam, Letaken Olam, to correct, improve the world, B'malchus Shakai, with the kingdom of the Ribbon Shalom. Invariably, those who have slipped out, those Jews, Jewish organizations that have come up with alternatives to the halachic position, skip the second phrase. They make a wrong assumption. It doesn't work. They think you can go straight for Tikkun Olam, but then there's nothing special about our message or anybody else's message. It's all the same. And once there's such an equation, then what you're doing is encouraging, facilitating, promoting assimilation on one level or another. Because if there's nothing unique to us or our message, then there's no reason for us to be so chauvinistic and ethnically centripetal, directed inward to perfect our statement and our lifestyle so that we can then, as a nation, impact the world. Ultimately, yes, we want to get to that, but you can't skip the step. One time I thought that I remember growing up in New York, roughly 106 years ago when I was in high school, and the Manhattan had a section called the Bowery, where there were invariably alcoholics that somehow they hung out there. Very brittle matchstick men. They hardly ate. They weren't drinking single malt Macallans or Lagavulin. Right? The stuff they were drinking was, I'm sure, more deleterious. So somebody decides, he wakes up in the morning, theoretically. He decides he wakes up in the morning, he wants to devote his life to an altruistic mission, and he picks up one of these matchstick men and holds him up against the lamppost, and if he walks away, the guy falls. So he has to stand there. And he stands there for hours and hours. He's got to do this. As soon as he interrupts his holding him, the guy collapses. And then there's a second guy who wants to do something for the world. And he says, you know what? I'm going to improve myself. I'm going to work on myself. I'm going to lock myself in my attic, and I'm going to develop my talent, my ability as a poet, as a composer, as a painter, and I'm going to be completely self-oriented during this period of gestation. And after 25 years, he goes out and says, okay, world, now exploit me. I think we can make the case that those who have succeeded in developing their genius, very clear when it comes to medical research, but even in the arts, in the humanities, those who have developed a certain innovative insight about the nature of man and how man works have helped and contributed to the growth of mankind, Tikun Olam, in a more fundamental way than holding up one particular alcoholic. Can't say that that's not an altruistic act. The question is, where is it more benefit for more people ultimately in the world? Now substitute when the Pasuk says, the verse says about the Jews, that the Jews are a mamlechet kohanim. They're a nation of priests, substitute a nation of artists. We've been charged with a certain responsibility to create certain realities about harnessing the natural bent of man, which is to indulge, to take pleasure. And we've been charged with the mission of harnessing that and using it in a productive manner. And the halachic norm has given us a formula where we can, as it were, chemically translate the material into the spiritual. We go into the laboratory and we come up with the retort, with the formulas on how to translate from one form and one reality into another. And so, if the Jew delays his achievement, he's really doing a disservice to the world. Because we're working from a very audacious premise. Yes, it's chutzpah. But our chutzpah, our audacity, is rooted in an empirical reading of history. Could be it's a quirk of fate that 24% of Nobel Prize winners are Jews. Could be just lucked out. Could be it's a function of anti-Semitism and we overreacted. But isn't that in itself a question? Why was there so much anti-Semitism? Why is there today so much anti-Semitism? Could be that whoever authored the verse that said, nobody would ever make the claim in Hoshana, nobody would ever make the claim that an entire nation witnessed the miraculous event that created that interaction with the divinity. Now, if we were going into business tomorrow and we wanted to start a religion, isn't that the best claim to make? Instead of saying it's a few people here, a few people there, and trying to market them, finding a good media person to promote them, isn't it better to say an entire nation? So there are two components here. One is that there's a prediction that nobody would ever make such a claim. In fact, nobody did make such a claim. Why not? And why should somebody have taken the risk to predict that nobody would ever make such a claim? The Kuzari talks about this. Our local Hasidic philosopher, Rabbi David Gottlieb, has written a wonderful book discussing this at length. The answer is that as soon as you say everybody, you can't get away with it unless it's in fact true. As long as you allow for, somebody comes along and says, I wasn't there, my uncle wasn't there, my sister, my brother-in-law. Okay. But as soon as you say everybody, you're stuck. So somebody, even according to the naysayers, the skeptics, at some point in time, somebody went on record and said it would never happen. In fact, it never happened. Strange. Remember, we always talk about evidence, we don't talk about proof. Proof means something is hermetically sealed. It's the preferred use of the term. Evidence means that there's a preponderance of reason that you should take this position rather than the other position. But it depends on what we call objectivity. Sometimes newcomers pitch up at Osameach, and they've been here a few weeks, they already are alert to the fact that, wait a minute, if I buy into this system, that means I just had my last cheeseburger. So I asked them, tell me, you're in classes now that you're going to hear some cases made for evidence that Torah is true, that this halachic norm to live this way is a way to achieve fulfillment, the way to achieve it. It's not just reward and punishment, it's fulfillment. It's to have the perfect interaction between the material and the spiritual. But you already heard that these books on my shelf here in the office and in the Beis Medrash, called Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Law, say don't eat that cheeseburger. And a fair amount of other do's and don'ts. Now make believe, you have good imagination, make believe the following. Make believe that instead of saying, wear tzitzis, put on tefillin, don't eat that cheeseburger, instead of that, the Shulchan Aruch said, live a hedonistic Epicurean existence. Indulge yourself, and you're going to be the judged on the day of judgment by your Maker. I gave you the capacity to indulge, and if you indulge recklessly, randomly, without any consideration of any other variables, that'll be your key to eternity. Make believe that was the Shulchan Aruch. Now go back and look at the same evidence. The same evidence that Rabbi Gottlieb, Rabbi Breidowitz, Schiller, that they present. That's also GBS. Remember GBS? GBS, remember, another reason to come to Osamer is to improve your secular education. GBS was George Bernard Shaw. He's the one who said, those who can do, those who can't teach. And we used to add, and those who can't teach, teach teachers. And those who can't teach teachers write textbooks. Right? But Osameach had another, I like to refer to another GBS. There was Grandma Bobby Schiller. That was our GBS, Lahavdil. And she used to point to a picture of her father in Minsk, who was a Rebbe and a Cheder. And she used to say, imagine how many lives he shaped by teaching them Torah. We make a blessing in the morning that the Ribono Shel Olam is a teacher. Hamalamed Torah la'amo Yisrael. What greater task is there than to share God's plan for the world with others? So it's GBS versus GBS. And Gottlieb, Breidowitz, and Schiller, that's our GBS, right? We paskin like Grandma Bobby Schiller, not like George Bernard Shaw. And so, when you're evaluating, is this a game plan? Is this a reasonable way to live? Keep in mind, hold yourself suspect, that what would you rather see? Would you rather see a way out, that Tikun Olam, perfecting the world, correcting the world, improving the world, should not have details and particulars about tzitzis, tefillin, what's a kezayis, what's not a kezayis? Now, there's an aside here that's fascinating. The aside is that once you're in the swim of it, once you entered into the sukkah of it, totally, there's nothing that's more fulfilling, and that brings about a state of simcha. That's why the peak of simcha is Sukkot. Because then every facet of your existence has meaning. All of a sudden, you become important because you are participating in the orchestration of the symphonic rendition of this generation's singing the anthem of what Torah has to give, because it really starts the other way. The Ribono Shel Olam authored the Torah, Chazal say, and then created the world like an architect working from a blueprint. We are created in relation to the Torah. So the ultimate fulfillment works that way. And so, I used to tell a story in New York of a Jew that hot, blistering, humid day, mid-August in New York, 70 years ago. This thin Jew gets lost and he wanders into a non-Jewish section of Brooklyn, an Irish-Italian section, and he must get in out of the sun. He wanders into a pub, into a tavern, and he orders a cold glass of beer. There are two non-Jews sitting at the other end of the bar. They're a bit high, and they're having a contest who can squeeze an orange with one hand more to fill up a glass. They're laughing, knocking over glasses, filling glasses. Finally, after a little while, they take note of this thin Jew sitting at the other end, quietly drinking his beer. And they throw down an orange. They roll down on the bar, and they slide a glass across. And they say, "Okay, Jew, let's see what you can do." This fella, rather nonplussed, unimpressed, he says, "You know what? Throw me down the peel of the orange that you just squeezed." Look at him like he's crazy. They throw down the peel of the already squeezed orange. And he takes that peel and he squeezes it and he fills up a glass and a second glass. And it spills over onto the counter. They're shocked. They're stunned. How did you do that? I'm a fundraiser for a Jewish organization. But I would like to use that, I would like to reapply that. Taking the orange and squeezing it for its spirituality. The juice is the spirituality. The orange is the material representation of a spiritual essence. And that's every mitzvah. Every time I make a bracha on an orange, a Torah creates, I am identifying the relationship between my taste buds, the enzymes that work to create the taste in my tongue, communicate to my brain, and the nature of how this orange is designed. Didn't have to be that way. Everything could have tasted like castor oil. But it is that way. And so the Jew is asked, structure it. There are definitely, we work Sukkadik. The total human experience enters in, but it needs mechitzot. There's that which has to be kept out and kept in my complete experience. And as the Meshech Chochmah says, there's no need physically, psychologically, sociologically, of the human condition that there is not a platform to express it and actualize it within the halachic norm. Do I have to know? Of course. My Rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg, in Baltimore, once told me that he quoted a Gemara. He was speaking some non-Orthodox group, non-halachic group outside of Baltimore, and he quoted a Gemara that says that for every non-kosher food, there's a comparable kosher food that has a similar taste. So somebody came over to him afterwards and said, okay, here's my menu, and if you can give me the exact corresponding taste, I'll consider the possibility of becoming kosher. Of course, he couldn't supply it. He said, theoretically it's true, but it doesn't mean that I can necessarily supply it for you. mention to you that that was the same group that some months later he was giving a lecture, and somebody jumped up. A fellow happened to be a psychiatrist, lived in that community, a suburb of Baltimore, again, not a halachically observant group. And this psychiatrist got up and said, "I'm asking you to stop speaking." Must have been about 40, 50 people in the room. Everybody was shocked. So what's your problem? He said, because if you continue speaking, you're going to persuade me. I don't want to be persuaded. The other people in the room said, ridiculous. So you leave. He got up and left. So Rav Weinberg asked me, who was more honest, him or them? You can listen to something that's persuasive, that makes sense, that's reasonable, and you can make believe you didn't hear it. Nature, Chinuch says, a human being is a psychological creature. Take a tzaddik and coerce him to do evil, after a while there'll be an erosion of his sensitivity to the evil. Take an evil man and bribe him to do good, he'll begin to develop a bit of a feeling for the good. And so, Sukkot is a time of peak simcha. It would seem to be counterintuitive that the time I bring in the bounty from the fields, I'm supposed to be super happy, and you ask me to go out of my home, right, with the luxurious furniture, all that comfort, and sleep and eat in the sukkah. Isn't that counterintuitive? That's going to bring to simcha? Yes. Because if you're waiting for the beef and the wine to deliver happiness unto themselves, doesn't work. If you use it, you squeeze the material experience for its spirituality, you make a bocha. But you need another dimension. Once a year, there's a certain opportunity to appreciate that the material is transitory. It disappears. If you relate to it only unto itself, then it self-implodes. Bullock sends an email to Bilam, and he writes in the email, Am yotzo miMitzrayim. A nation went out of Mitzrayim, they went out of Egypt, right, which was the place of super licentiousness, super indulgence, hedonistic society. V'chisa es ein ha'ot. They covered the essence of the land. Most people learned that there were just so many of them, you can't see the ground. The Sfas Emes says, they changed our attitude towards the physical universe. They say that it's all about spirituality. And that since we are this subtle blend, complex blend of the material and the physical, the material and the spiritual, we cannot access the spiritual except through the physical, but that's only using the halachic route to get there. And so, Bullock resented the fact that we can't just approach the physical with indulging, that it's a resource for spirituality. In fact, the greatest enemy of our time, in our era, Hitler, Yamach Shemo V'Zichro, writes in Mein Kampf, I've taken out after the Jews because they are the conscience of the world. I would submit that the first Rashi in Chumash that we're going to read in a few days talks about why does Torah have to begin with creation, all this cosmology, the complexity of creation. Rashi, in paraphrasing Chazal, anticipates that our being in Eretz Yisrael will always be contentious. The nations of the world find it intolerable for us to be here. Why? Because it's a sukkah. It's one big sukkah. It's the totality of the human experience. Yehoshua comes into Eretz Yisrael, he legislates urban legislation for how to have an ecologically sound environment. Everything is grist for the mill. The total human experience. Not part-time, not a commercial on a broadcast, but the total human experience. That's Sukkah, and that's Eretz Yisrael. And these are the two mitzvahs that the Gra finds in Tilim, by Hi B'Shalem Sukkoi, by Nosei B'Tzion. And that is thematically the connection. Those two mitzvahs make a statement that we are here in order to fulfill our mandate is to utilize everything that our Creator gave us to connect to the Creator and to bring that mission statement through Klal Yisrael, through the Jewish people. That's Sukkah, that's the mitzvah on the day of judgment that the Gentile nations fail. That's the Arbeiter. That separates between the men and the boys. And that is ultimately, the nations of the world find it hard to accept, impossible to accept, us being here in a Torah state. And there's always the threat that when Jews are here, it can evolve into a Torah state. Surely there are Jews here in Eretz Yisrael that are doing their best to delay that, but in spite of themselves, and because of some that have contributed, there is a growing world of Torah, and we're moving somehow closer to creating that Sukkah national state with mechitzas, Yaakov, mechitzas, partition. There is that which is outside, which I can't yet elevate, and there's that which is within. And only then will we, in turn, help bring about what the world wants of us ultimately is Tikun Olam. But how? The Malchus Shakai. The two have to inseparably go together. Chag Sameach.